Hello, my name is Marcia Lehman, and I'm a Knox County Master Gardener. Today's topic is building raised bed garden boxes. We're talking solely about building boxes, not about filling them, just how to best construct the actual raised bed box. Before we start, let's talk about the types of materials you can use. Lumber is by far the most common, just because of the initial cost and how long it will live. Your choices in lumber are those that are best for raised bed boxes include white oak, cedar, and locust, because they can be untreated and they will last quite a while. Pressure treated lumber is also now useful because they no longer treat them with arsenic. So it is safe to use in places where you're growing vegetables. You can use the newer composite decking materials such as Trex. This is not a particular recommendation for that brand. That's just an example. The one concern I would have about the composite decking material is it only comes in a single thickness, which is about an inch, and we really want to use something that's about 2 inches thick. I've seen people build temporary raised beds out of straw bales. You can use concrete blocks, you can use stacked stone, but in this tutorial, we'll be using pressure treated lumber because that is the most readily available and probably your least expensive option. Now, we recommend that many garden beds are made 4 feet wide and 8 feet long. Why do we say that? Well, for starters, 4 feet is the maximum recommended width, which means that from either side, you have to reach in 2 feet to get to the middle of the bed. Some gardeners find that their arms just aren't that long, and so they'll make their beds 3 feet wide. And if your bed is backing up to an obstruction, whether that's a wall or a fence, that you can only access it from one side, then your bed should really only be 2 feet wide. But we're talking about a place where you can put a bed out in a relatively open space and access it from all 4 sides. 4 foot by 8 foot is the general recommendation. 8 feet on the length is recommended because if it's much longer than that, the pressure of the soil may cause the sides to bow, in which case you would need to put some additional support on the sides. So it's just easier to go with an 8 foot length because those don't usually bow. The other is another reason, even I could haul 8 foot lumber in my little Scion XB and I could avoid paying a delivery charge. One of the factors I really like is that I can buy all 8 foot long lumber and take one of those boards, cut it in half, and now I have 2 4 foot pieces to make the end of the bed. And a lot of the big box stores like Home Depot and Lowe's will make free cuts. Just keep in mind they don't make project cuts. That means they're not precise. You might get 4 feet and a quarter on one side, which means you have 3 feet 11 3/4 on the other side. But as long as you match up short pieces and get them the same length, you're okay. That means that with 3 pieces of 8 foot long lumber, I can make one raised bed because 2 of those pieces will make a side. The third piece you cut in half, you have your 2 ends. And so by using 8 foot long lumber and making beds 4 by 8, you have no scrap lumber. So it's been a few years, but the last time I made a set of boxes, I was making 6. I had some other master gardeners ask me to document the process. So I took a whole lot of still photos, and that's why the presentation is in the form it is today. So I did this. When I go and buy lumber from a big box, Home Depot or Lowe's type, I pick through the inventory to find boards that are not warped, that don't have cracks and have minimal knots. You will not find boards with no knots. This is usually a number 2 select grade. And it'll take me a little bit of time and effort to dig through the pile and get the number of pieces that I need. But I never have to buy extra lumber. And since they'll make free cuts, I would have them cut 1/3 of my boards in half for the ends, and that saves me time in not having to cut the lumber at home, and it makes it a little easier for me to transport it in my car. When I buy pressure treated lumber from a commercial entity, such as Christmas lumber, there I buy a number 1 grade lumber. It's been treated with copper, it's been heat treated, and they will deliver in the Knoxville area at no charge. The trade-off here is that I don't get to pick the boards. So when I'm buying from a commercial entity such as Christmas lumber, I usually purchase 10% extra in case I get a board that is warped or cracked that I can use somewhere else, but I don't want it in my raised bed box. And the other is that most of the commercial places will not make cuts for you. But that's a trade-off that you can decide what to do. So each bed that I'm making is going to be 4 feet wide and 8 feet long. That means I need 3 8-foot long boards for each bed. 2 of the boards will make up a long size, and the third board will be cut in half to make the 2 ends. Now, I purchased 2-inch by 8-inch, meaning 2-inch thick, and my beds are going to be 8 inches high. That's probably the minimum, because the 8 inches is a nominal dimension. Everybody knows a 2x4 is not really 2 inches by 4 inches. It's 1.5 inches by 3.5 inches. And the same happens here. That 2 by 8 inch dimension is really 1.5 by 7.5. You can go and make your beds deeper than that, but as those boards get bigger, they get heavier and harder to handle, but they also get more expensive. So minimally, you would want to use a 2 by 8, those are inches, by 8 feet long. So here's my 8-foot long boards. I purchased 2-inch by 8-inch, number 1 grade, pressure treated. This particular lumber came from Christmas lumber. I needed 18 boards to make my 6 beds, but since I didn't get to choose the boards, I ordered and had 20 boards delivered. And this is my pile of lumber that's going to end up being 6 4 by 8 foot raised beds. If you purchase from Home Depot or Lowe's and have them cut the end boards, then you can skip this step. But if you need to cut, the first thing I did was I took the boards that I'm going to cut in half to make the ends, and I laid them out on the driveway. And you can see here that I have them up on, I took 4 other boards to put under them, but here are the boards that I am going to cut to make the end boards, but I need to get them up off the concrete for cutting purposes. One more reason that if you can have the big box store cut for you, you can skip this step. Oh, let me back up. And what I did was I put a board over here in the end to get all the edges lined up. That's how I get such a straight line here of the boards that I'm about to cut. Okay? Again, if you had Home Depot or Lowe's cut your lumber, you can skip this step. But what I did was I measured in 48 inches and I drew a line, which didn't show up real well. So I put this yellow dotted line here to highlight it. But here are the 6 boards that are going to be cut in half to make my end boards. And I just used a circular saw, and now you see why I had those 4 boards underneath supporting them. This way I get no tipping of the boards as I cut. They're well supported, and then I can take my circular saw, cut through here, and I've got my ends for 6 boxes. So if you had somebody else cut that lumber for you, this is where you're starting. Now I like to use lag bolts as opposed to decking screws, but you can use decking screws if cost is really an issue for you. So when I'm using lag bolts on an 8-inch deep bed, I would put 2 of those in each corner. So in each bed, I'm going to have 8 lag bolts. And we know the lumber is 1.5 inches thick. So I come down 2 inches and I come in 3/4 of an inch. And I'm going to mark those spots. So 2 inches in down from what's going to be the top, 2 inches from what's going to be the bottom, and 3/4 of an inch in from the edge. And 3/4 is half of 1.5. So that means my lag bolt's going to go dead center into the sideboard. That will become a little more obvious as we go along. But I marked all these boards. You can see all my markings on the adjacent boards. And here's where I'm going to drill the holes on the end boards. I'm still working on the short 4-foot pieces. So they're all marked 2 inches from either side and 1/2 inch in from the end grain. And then I get out my drill, and since I was going to be using 5/16 lag bolts, I drilled a 5/16 inch hole. You don't have to go any bigger. Again, if you choose to use deck screws, I would use more than 2 on an end. I would probably put 3, and you wouldn't need to pre-drill any holes. But my preference and my recommendation is that you use lag bolts. They just grip better and hold longer. So I've got all my end boards cut. I've got them all drilled to accommodate the lag bolts. Time to do a little bit of cleanup. So I get out my broom and I just sweep everything off. And here we go. This is my 5/16 inch lag bolt, just slipped in the hole to show you. Again, this is an end board. This was a test fit. And when I actually put it in, I will include a washer. But since I was just test fitting my 5/16 inch lag bolt in a 5/16 inch hole, I didn't need the washer at this point. This shows you the lag bolts I was using in this build were 3.5 inches. So this shows you really how long the board is. Now keep in mind that the end board is 1.5 inches thick, and I'll show you this in the next slide. But you don't want to go anything shorter than 3 inches because it has to go through the 1.5 inch wide end board and then into the sideboard. So you'd only have 1.5 inches into the sideboard. By using a 3.5 inch lag bolt, I get 2 inches going into the sideboard. And I just think that's better. This is a better picture. Here's the lag bolt with a washer on it. And you can see that, 1.5 inches of it will be in the end board, and that leaves me this much to go into a sideboard. So, one last thing, before you start to build the boxes, be sure to take off all the tags and pull the staples out of the end. You'd be amazed how that 1/16 of an inch can throw off or make more difficult the actual construction of the box. So just get rid of all those tags and be sure to pull all the staples that held those tags. Okay, now we're ready. We need to get the corners of these boxes square. If you're going to have several boxes and they're going to line up in a row, if they are not square, it will be obvious. It may not be obvious as you're building the individual boxes, but when you go and set them in place, if they're not square, it will catch your eye. If you don't care, that's okay. But I used both a quick square, which is what this is, and I also used a carpentry square that I happen to have in my shop. I used both of these, and it just made the job a little easier. And here you can see, this is how the lag bolts will go in. This is the end board. This is the 4-foot board. This is the side board, the 8-foot long board. And just to get started, I just took a hammer and would tap the lag bolt through the end board just enough to grab the sideboard, and then I got my arm work out. I used a ratchet to tighten up the corners. And if you have an adapter that fits on a power drill, that would make this job a whole lot easier. But the point is, if I back up here, I got these corners square before I put in the lag bolts, okay? And then I cranked, and it took a bit. So if you've got a power drill attachment, by all means, use it. So now what I've got, I've done one corner of one box. This is the easy part, but now I have basically an L-shaped half box. I'm going to go to the opposite corner and do the same thing. So I square it up, and then I put in the, oops, lost my place. So this is the second corner that I'm working on. It's opposite from the first corner. And when I get that assembled, now I have two L-shaped pieces of half boxes. That's the easy part because I had no constraints in putting those first two corners together. When I go to the third corner, now it gets a little more challenging because the one other end or one other side is already constructed. So this is where you definitely want to get it square. In the fourth corner, the last corner you try to do will have the most constraint on it. But you just repeat this process. Get them squared up, hammer the lag bolt into the end, tighten it down with the ratchet, and move to the next corner. When you get all four corners done, you've used 8 lag bolts and 8 washers, and you're going to say, how do I know that this is really square? Well, you can feel confident that by using the quick square and the carpentry square, you did a good job. But if you really want to confirm that your box is square, measure the diagonal this way, then measure the opposite diagonal. And when those two numbers are the same, your box is perfectly square. So does it have to be perfect? No, just by squaring it up as you do each corner, you're going to be really close. But if you're like me and you just want to know for sure that it's perfectly square, measure the two diagonals, and then you know. Now, as I was doing this, you may notice some tape marks on the floor, or not. There's some masking tape there. But what I did after I got the first one perfectly square, and it helped that I was doing this in my garage where the floor is level. You can do this in the driveway. If the driveway has a bit of a slope, yeah, you'll be really close, but not perfect. So if you've got a place like a garage floor that is level, your odds of getting a perfectly square box will be higher. So once I got, and part of the reason that I took these diagonal measurements because I really wanted my first box to be perfectly square is for what I'm going to show you next. Once I got it perfectly square, I came back and I used painter's tape and I marked the inside and the outside of each corner. You can see here, I've got tape here on each corner. I did the same thing down here. And then you can see that I did the same thing on the inside of the box. So these tape marks are 1.5 inches apart because that's how thick this lumber is. But I marked all these corners. That made my setup for the 5 remaining boxes very rapid. So the first box took me an hour to build all by myself, doing all that squaring, getting it perfectly square so that I could make these tape marks. The remaining boxes took me about 25 minutes each to build. That's the value of getting the first one perfect and then making these markings to facilitate building the other boxes. So I then went back and repeated this process and built a total of 6 boxes. Here's all my markings on the floor. And in fact, some of this tape is still on my garage floor. That's a close-up. And then here are the 6 boxes that I built this afternoon. It took me a total from startup to finish, and that means cleanup. Everything was cleaned up, put away. I built 6 boxes in 4 hours, and I did that by myself. So if you had another set of helping hands, if you had space where you could have 2 crews of people building boxes at the same time, you could just knock out a half a dozen boxes in quick order. So this is what I was able to do by myself in 6 hours. So that's the basic recommendation for how to build a raised bed box. Filling them, well, that's a topic for another day, and we're likely to do a talk on that. Don't know exactly when, but check back often. In the meantime, if you have questions, you can always call the Knox County Extension Office, the helpline, which is often answered by Master Gardeners and is part of our Ask a Master Gardener program. And that phone number is area code 865-215-2340. You can also find us find this video on YouTube. Just look for Knox County Master Gardeners, and we have a whole library of videos. And we also have a Facebook page, same name, Knox County Master Gardeners. And you can come out there and ask a question, and we'll answer it. So I hope you found this useful. If you're thinking about building raised beds, it is not an overwhelming task, but this is just the basic construction of what is usually a pretty standard 4 foot by 8 foot, in this case 8 inches deep, raised bed box that's going to be used to grow vegetables in my backyard.